All right, hello to everyone who's joining us tonight across LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. We'll probably be just in a short introduction, waiting for more people to join us. But if you are here already, thanks for joining us tonight. We're right now 10 p.m. in China, should be 7 a.m. on the east coast of the west coast of the USA, 10 a.m. on the east coast, and should be about 4 p.m. in Europe. So if you would like to let me know where you're watching from, feel free to drop it in the comments. And shortly we're going to be starting to talk a little bit more about the topic of China experts and how do we define and shape expertise on China, considering China is such an important country, such an important force in the world today. It behooves us, especially those of us from countries outside of China, from Western nations, to be able to have an accurate understanding and also to help others understand China in an accurate way. Otherwise, it may be very hard to compete effectively against this growing power. So we will be delving into that. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X right now. So we'll be waiting for a few more people to join, and then we should be able to start and get into some of the details. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sean. I've worked in China for 15 years, and that includes companies, working for companies like Huawei in both the telecoms, corporate communications, and the smartphone sector. I've also worked with a number of smaller companies. I've worked with Chinese cryptocurrency companies. I've worked with Chinese new energy and solar companies. And I've also worked in other areas such as gaming and furniture. And interesting enough, when I was finishing up my master's degree, I actually had the opportunity to work with the Chinese government, not the central government, but we did work with one of the local governments in the city of Jiaxing. That was back in 2009, and we helped them do some strategic research on how to better design science parks and tech incubators, which was, at the time at least, a fairly popular topic. So what we're going to be delving into today is going to be really talking about, at least from the perspective of someone like myself who has lived and worked in China for so long, about how many of the perspectives, it could be personal perspectives, it could be business perspectives, it could be political perspectives, how many of these perspectives are, how would I put this, who are shaped by, I won't say complete misinformation, because there's certainly much of China that we can see in the media. There's much of China that we can see by watching the news, but none of it is necessarily quite accurate, or I would say much of it is not quite accurate. And considering China and knowledge about China shapes so many incredibly important and complex decisions, whether it be the U.S. government opening up a trade war on China with tariffs, whether it be the European Union trying to decide, what tech companies from China to let in. I think in the UK at least we previously had at least 100% tariff on EVs. And so how to deal with China, how to compete with China, how to collaborate with China is very important. And if you do not have a accurate understanding of the country, or if you have people who are pretending to be experts. We saw that at least with Mr. Navarro, who wrote a book with fake sources pretending to be a China expert. If you have people that are advising either out of ignorance or in bad faith, it can really steer the different countries in the wrong direction. And so this is something I say as an American, where I believe very strongly that we need to have a future where we can work with and collaborate with China. But considering, if we look at China speed, which I talked about in a previous live stream, considering the advantage that China has built up, not just controlling so much manufacturing, but also being able to do it so much faster and quicker, more efficiently at scale than Western countries are able to do, if we don't come to grips with that, then the speed at which they, in theory at least, could surpass us is fairly quick. So we'll be getting into some more of this. See, we have more people joining us. So if you have any comments, feel free to leave a comment. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of the live stream. But again, the goal of today is not to dictate to everyone what it definitely means to be a China expert. There's no be-all, end-all, it has to be this way definition. Instead, we're going to be talking about things that are important to gaining a more important, deeper understanding of China. So let's get into it on that note. So, now, one of the main issues that kind of defined, that kind of made me think about this topic was the fact that we hear people call themselves a China expert. It could be someone who is in government. It could be someone who is in business, who's worked in China or managed a team in China and calls themselves an expert on China. But it really doesn't tell us very much, if not anything, about what they actually know, because it's a very vague term and it doesn't really say anything. There's so many different facets, aspects of China that one might know about. Like, for example, me, myself, I very specifically say that I am I don't say expert, I would say a specialist. I say I specialize in working with Chinese companies, working within Chinese companies, helping Chinese companies go overseas, and bridging the gap between Chinese organizations and Western organizations. Now, we can even get a little bit more specific on that. I would say that I am specialized in working with private Chinese companies. I would not necessarily want to work with Chinese state-owned companies, because even within China, the country, there's going to be different styles of organization, and you can't be an expert on everything. It doesn't make sense. There's going to be much different organizational speed, different ways the hierarchies work. So that's just an example. And so I'm always very cautious whenever I hear someone saying that they are a China expert, because it really doesn't mean anything. And if someone really is an expert on some aspect of China, they would almost certainly tell you that. You know, there's one guy, David Fishman, I follow on Twitter. He is an expert in the energy sector, so that's very, very specific, and he talks about that a lot, and so I enjoy hearing what he has to say. There's other expats on LinkedIn that I follow, and they talk about very specific things, like some people talk about logistics, some people talk about manufacturing, some people talk about sales. So anytime that someone does not have a very specific way to describe what they know about China, it does make me suspicious. And that's why we're talking about, if we do know something about China, let's be very specific so that we can speak very clearly about what our expertise is. So therefore, we're going to talk about a number of things that I myself have experienced throughout my time living and working in China. If any of you have any other ideas, any other thoughts that you'd like to contribute, definitely feel free to let me know. It's not a me telling you type of discussion. If you would like to share your own thoughts and experiences, we can definitely discuss those. But as a starting point, I will be sharing what I have understood from working and living in China. And again, let's also understand that it is shaped by my own experiences, where I have spent more time living and interacting with local Chinese as opposed to expatriates. I've worked inside Chinese companies as opposed to working inside Western companies in China. And I've worked more inside the tech sector. So my own experience, my own style is therefore much more faster paced as opposed to a slower pace that you might find in other countries. So just keep that in mind. And again, if you have any comments you're on YouTube, if you're on LinkedIn, if you're on X, Twitter, feel free to drop a comment and I'll either answer as we go or I'll answer at the end or as we get to certain sections. But again, if you're joining us, thank you, and it's good to have you here, and I'm glad to have you all here to talk about China. So let's go on to the next section. So why China expertise matters. China's global influence is growing, I won't say by leaps and bounds, but it has been going higher and higher. They're at a dead heat with my home country of the United States. They're potentially leading, or at least in a dead heat with us on AI. They're very important for many tech industries. They're leading in areas like robotics, high-tech manufacturing. I mean, we can't even make an iPhone in the United States for less than 3 times what it costs to make in China. So let's not underestimate how much more powerful and much more influential China is getting in the world. And as I mentioned at the start of the stream, decisions about China impact everything from business, politics, and culture. And if we are going to if we or our representatives in the government or the heads of our companies are going to be able to make these decisions in an informed way, they have to actually understand China. But considering many of them may have not learned any Chinese, may not understand Chinese culture, Chinese historical background, they may not have spent much time in China, like Jensen Huang, who is coming on a regular basis, I think. Tim Cook from Apple has come. But many business leaders have not come to spend time in China, and which tells me that they may not really understand China. So, in addition to the rise of China, in addition to China developing more influence, China developing more power, we also have some worrying trends, especially in my own home country of the United States, where we have less people studying the language and culture. We have the trend that's been going on for the last several decades, whereas a lot of the main people who interface directly with China and Chinese people were in the business community. And, and they, sometimes, some of them, myself, others definitely would interact directly with the Chinese. But others, maybe they go through intermediaries. Maybe they have a key person on their team who speaks Chinese and English, and that's the person who helps pass all the orders along. And so if that's the case, then maybe they don't understand how to do everything on their own. We have many expats who live in China. We have at least tens of thousands, I think, at least in Shenzhen, hundreds of thousands of different expatriates, different expats from different countries. But if they're living just among themselves, if they have their own expat community, then they aren't spending time among the locals, and I would question whether or not they can actually understand China, the Chinese people that well, if they're not actually making that part of their everyday lives, which is something I try and do. And then, of course, another thing that's important to remember is that, people think China, and they may think, oh, well, there's the Chinese language, there's China, there's Chinese culture, but it's not that simple. Why is it not that simple? It's because, first of all, there's many different, at least on the global scale, we have mainland China, we have special administrative zones like Hong Kong, like Macau, that are, were from China, but they spent time being managed by foreign governments before they came back to the fold. And they do have different dialects, Cantonese, for example, and they will have somewhat different cultures. And then, of course, we have the overseas diaspora, where people who have lived for generations in the United States and Europe and other countries, and well, just because they're ethnically Chinese and culturally Chinese, there are still many societal differences that will change from countries overseas to actual China, to Hong Kong, to Taiwan. All of these have differences. You can't simply take one person from the United States who was raised in the Chinese household, send them over to mainland China or even Hong Kong or Taiwan and expect them to function exactly the same. It doesn't work that way. But many of these differences I think are lost on the people who make some of these decisions. One of the tropes we hear in business is we hear that, maybe there's a Western company that needs someone to help deal with their operations in China, or even a Chinese company that wants to hire someone to help oversee their operations in foreign countries. And maybe what happens is they say, let's get a Chinese American to help us out in America, and they expect the Chinese American because they are ethnically Chinese. And this is something that Chinese companies, Chinese people can make this mistake as well too, but it happens in the reverse as well. They'll think, they're Chinese American, so of course they can help bridge the cultural gap. And unless someone who's, say, Chinese American or Chinese European has spent time in the mainland Chinese culture, then they don't necessarily understand that. So when we're, say, for example, if we're talking about the term, not China expert, because I don't like that, but expertise on China, I personally would say I have expertise on mainland China. I would not say I have expertise on Taiwan. I'm sure there's similarities, and I'm sure that if I spent some time studying, I could get used to it, but I'm not going to say right now that I have expertise in Taiwan or Hong Kong or Macau or even necessarily diaspora communities in the United States where I'm from. So it can be very complex. So if you have any questions on China, learning about China, feel free to drop them in the comment section. We're on YouTube, X, and LinkedIn. So if you're joining us here today, welcome. And you can always view this stream on replay on, again, LinkedIn, YouTube, and I think X as well too. So if you have somewhere to be, you can always come back and take a look. Or if you have any questions on China, you're always free to send me a direct message, leave me a comment on any of these platforms, because I generally am sharing a lot about life in China, work in China on a regular basis. So the first pillar that I think is important to understand China, it really is the language. No, because we see a lot of people learning about China, maybe they don't actually learn the language. And I personally would not say that you definitely have to learn the language to really understand China. I think it's extremely helpful. I think you face many more barriers to understanding China if you don't learn the language. I think the best example I can think of is that it's like a game of telephone, because there are so many differences in the Chinese language. There are metaphors, there are different expressions. I mean, one of the jobs I had early on when I was working with Huawei was I was doing lots of corporate communications, lots of writing, editing work for speeches, articles, for Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei, for other executives, other important leaders. And we often found a very Chinese, very indirect way of communication from these leaders. And there's often a big problem when maybe they wanted to directly translate these concepts, these ideas into English, because for them it felt like it had a very strong, very deep, very important meaning. However, when you directly translate these concepts into English or to another language, they don't flow well. They don't make sense. And so the only way that we, say on the Westerners on the Huawei overseas communication team, were able to understand that is by looking at the actual Chinese, understanding the cultural background, And then only then were we able to kind of then try and find the best way to translate this into, say, to English. And there was never a perfect answer because there is such a big a big cultural gap, not just in the culture, but also in the language, how the language is expressed. And because of that, if you don't understand both sides, then it can be very hard to bridge the gap in your mind to understand what the other side means, what the other side is trying to say. It can be that complex sometimes. And that's simply how it is. And here's another example I think is good, and I've used this a few times in the past. I told you before about the complexities just now, about trying to take more traditional, more formal leaders' comments and speeches and take them and then translate them and to communicate them in English. But I'd also like to mention that just because someone speaks really good Chinese, it still doesn't necessarily make them the ideal expert on China, because even though language can help with many things, it's not the be-all, end-all. And there's one person I remember, a Brit in Huawei, and his Chinese was phenomenal. And I even heard Chinese teammates say that potentially just being nice, that his Chinese was better than theirs as native Chinese speakers. The problem is that while his language skills were excellent, he didn't really have much empathy or cultural nuance or really a bedside manner in terms of dealing with people at the office. And so you ended up having someone who spoke, wrote, understood Chinese excellently, but he was always rubbing everybody the wrong way. And so it's not only that you have to speak Chinese, you actually have to be able to interact with Chinese people, you have to be able to understand how to deal with Chinese people. Otherwise, how can you advise someone on how to work with and interact with Chinese organizations and people? But so that's something important to keep in mind. That's why we're talking about multiple pillars, because you could certainly start from one pillar or another pillar, but ideally you have multiple pillars that can all help inform your views on and understanding of China. And only then, when you have a greater understanding of the Chinese culture, the Chinese country, only then can you help yourself and others make more informed decisions on China. So, give me one sec, and then we'll be moving on. If there's any questions so far on the first pillar, why the Chinese language is important to understanding China, feel free to let me know. I'll do a short pause for a sec, and then if there's any questions, you can let me know. I see we have a number of people from both X and LinkedIn with us. So again, if you're joining us live, thanks very much for joining the event today. My name is Sean. I'm based in Shenzhen, China. I work with Chinese organizations going overseas, as well as Western organizations that are trying to understand how to work better with China. So again, if you have any comments on YouTube, on X, on LinkedIn, feel free to drop them in, or you can also send me a DM later and we can chat more. It's a very interesting topic about what we need to do to not become an expert on China, because as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't really believe in the idea of a China expert. I believe in people having expertise in specific aspects of China. Me, myself, my specialty is working with Chinese organizations to go overseas and bridging the gap between organizations. I do speak fluent Chinese. It's not perfect, it's not native level, but it's enough to talk with CEOs, business decision makers, and having that, not just the language skill, but also that cultural nuance and background, it really helps bridge the gap much more effectively. So with that being said, and I see people are going to be holding their comments till later, which is completely fine. And on LinkedIn at least, if you can always just leave a comment on the event page even after the event's over, I believe, so that's also fine. So let's move on to the second pillar, which is really kind of understanding the culture and spending time on the ground, which both of which I think are very important. Just going off of what I just said about language not being the only thing, important but not the only thing. So, as I just mentioned earlier in the stream, China is very complex, it's very nuanced. Not only are there many different regions, there's mainland China, there's Hong Kong, there's Macau, there's Taiwan, there's overseas Chinese communities. All of these are different facets of China, and they all maybe work slightly differently. They all have the same ethnic background, they all have, shared history, shared cultural history, but they've also societally, organizationally developed differently where they are now. And so it's, you have to take that into account. And at the same time, you also have different historical periods in China. You have the more imperial history timeline, you have the modern history before the communist revolution, you have the communist period, and then after Mao died, you have the opening up period. And all of these have different aspects to them, and you can't really view China through one or the other. Here's a really good example, a case study I wanted to share. And one of the things that this is related to is, hold on, this should be it. One of the things I wanted to share, yeah, that should be fine. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to best share this. All right, so one of my cautions when it comes to China is we see a lot of people who have traditionally had expertise on China have been academics, and I think it's great. That's how I started my interest in China. I first came to China in 2001, and that was during a high school band trip. As I started learning a little Chinese then, I started experiencing the Chinese culture, and then when I came back and I started college, I started studying more academic subjects. I started studying academically the Chinese economy, Chinese business, Chinese art history, the Chinese language, and that was all good and fine. And I think there's many people who develop expertise on China who they spend their time in universities overseas. And that's primarily where they teach people about China or they learn about China themselves. But there is also limitations to that approach, being that if you're not here, you're always going to view China from the pages of the book and not actually on the street. And so this one tweet here, and again, if you want to follow me on X, Sean_China. But this was actually my response to someone named Orville Schell, and he's apparently someone of the Asia Society, I should say, which they're I guess apparently experts on Asia and China. And what really rubbed me the wrong way was I forget, it was back in 2020, and every year, every regular basis, they have floods throughout China. And so what he said was, here's the trouble, not only because such monumental floods will damage China's economy, but because they can play on Chinese fatalism and into the traditional notion of Tianming, or the mandate of heaven in English, that natural disasters signal cosmic displeasure with the ruling dynasty. So a little background here is that when emperors ruled China, whether it was the Ming dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, any of the different dynasties, and that's similar to how Western kings were viewed. Chinese emperors were thought to rule through the will of heaven, through whoever was in charge of the Chinese pantheon, kind of approving of them being the emperor of China, and that if there were disasters, if other things befell the country, they might be viewed as not having the mandate anymore, and which then might lead to peasants rebelling. Now, that's something I learned about when I was in university, when we read about Chinese history. So that definitely was a thing back then. The problem is that he's taking this very academic and historical concept, and he's applying this to modern China and to how the modern Chinese people will react to what's happening. And what I said and what a number of other people who maybe aren't academics but who live and work in China for a long time, we all said this was rubbish. It's, and I actually looked up this guy, and I believe at the time in 2020, he spent most of his time at university. I think at the time, the last time he'd been in China was in the 70s or the 80s, and that immediately set a red flag off for me because I said, hey, there's this guy who's an academic. He's obviously misusing a historical concept, and he's trying to incorrectly label it on or to place it upon modern China. And there might actually be people in government that are listening to this guy. Now, I don't know him. I don't know if this is just a post he made by accident. Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly. But it shows the limitations of taking a purely academic approach to China because, I've been, my first time in China was in 2001. I've lived and worked here, immersive in the culture for 15 years. I've never heard any single Chinese person talking about the mandate of heaven and how some natural disaster was going to affect how they viewed the Chinese government. Now, I'm not saying there aren't a small number, maybe in very small, very poor villages, I don't know. But the issue is that taking a completely academic approach can really make you misunderstand what modern China is like. So that is, very dangerous. We do not want people completely misreading China and then advise the US government, the European government, or Fortune 500 companies, because that would lose people a lot of money. Again, things like what's relevant, what's symbolic. Being here on the ground, you understand what the rhythm is. You understand what the unspoken rules are. And this is one reason why when I worked in China, I was the person who worked with the China team. I was based at the HQ. And so whenever you have the Western agencies, because oftentimes we want to do marketing overseas, and obviously I would be working on that from my end, but we would need support. And oftentimes agencies, even Chinese agencies, they wouldn't necessarily understand the unspoken rules, the unspoken needs inside the actual in-house Chinese company. But if you're not here, if you're not able to interface directly face-to-face, then it's very hard to really understand what's really going on. And so that's one of the things I do is that and just because you're on the other side doesn't mean the Chinese side can very easily communicate what they want to communicate to the Western side, the Western agency overseas. So, but the point is that if you want to understand China, or if you want to understand what a Chinese business is doing, it's best to be there on the ground. Otherwise, you're really just missing out on a lot of things. Now, another important point is, in previous streams and previous posts on LinkedIn and elsewhere, I've talked about how fast China moves. Part of this is related to the structural aspect of China's speed in terms of all of the factories and suppliers are located together, the logistics is located together. They are very comfortable moving and iterating very fast. And combined with the cultural element, if you combine that with how fast China moves, if you're not there on the ground, you're going to really not understand how fast the companies are moving, which can have an impact, not just politically, but from a business point of view. So I'm going to take a drink of water now, but that's pillar 2. Pillar 1 was the importance of understanding language, so you aren't playing the telephone, so you can actually understand what's happening. And then, of course, pillar 2, understanding the culture and being on the ground in China, or at least spending a good amount of time. Like at least every year, you should be here. If you want to understand China, you should be coming back every year because things change, and things change quickly. If you have any, oh, hold on. I think I see someone entered something in the chat. All right, so thanks very much for Sunny Shen Zhuan to join us. And For those of you who don't know, it was a post by Sunny, I believe, that inspired me to do this live stream. She had made a post on LinkedIn about I believe it was the same concept, how China expert is a bad topic, and I had commented on her post. And I believe there was a Western expatriate. I don't know him. I'm not going to make any judgments against him, but he had said he had seemed offended by the post, and he had said something along the lines of, "Hey, I've worked here for 20 years, and so of course I'm a China expert." Though that kind of goes into what we'll talk about a little later, is just because someone has managed a team in China as an expat for 20 years, does that really make them a China expert, or does that let them have expertise on China? But we'll get into that later. But for first now, let me take a look at Sunny's post. So can we share this? Okay, so yeah, so she says, to communicate with senior level Chinese leaders effectively, you need to read between the lines apart from speaking the Chinese language. That's for sure a big challenge for people who are from a low context culture. That's a very good point, because especially for Westerners, Western Europeans, Americans, we want to say something and then have someone understand it. Or we want our boss to say something and then just take it directly, I guess I'll say. And it's true, Chinese leaders, Asian leaders, they don't necessarily say exactly what they mean. For example, my career, in business, whenever, so let's say you're with an agency, or I'm just working in-house, and I'm saying, okay, here's our advice on how we handle this campaign or how we communicate on this issue. And oftentimes you'll have the China leader say, 我的想法是, like, oh, well, my thinking is this. And it seems very neutral, it seems very passive, but he's basically saying, you're wrong, I'm right, do what I say. But he's not going to say that directly. But that's only one example. There's many more. And so let's say if you are a Westerner, a non-Chinese, and you want to be able to learn how to communicate with Chinese leaders. You can't really do that from afar. You can't really do that over a Zoom call. You have to be there face to face. You have to be kind of watching their face, watch their body language. And of course you have to have some background on the Chinese culture. And of course, many are not going to speak English, or the language of the country where you are from. And that means that you probably need to know some Chinese. But then again, even if you speak fluent Chinese, you still then, as Sunny says, you have to also have the culture, you have to be able to kind of understand that. And this is something that we see, that there are organizational differences in China. And so I've seen many times where maybe, like for example, I was working at Vivo. I was leading global media and influencers, and we were working with one of the big Western agencies a few times, and they would send us a completely local Chinese team. But they still didn't necessarily understand what the needs of this Chinese company were, because they didn't come from that context. So there's, even for, at least in my experience, I will say, there are Chinese who work for Western firms and are used to that way of operating, can still have trouble communicating with Chinese from Chinese firms, especially more traditional, more formal Chinese firms. And then kind of, there's that gap too. But again, thank you very much to Shani for joining, for inspiring this live stream, and for the question. But yeah, so and that's just two pillars we've talked about: language, knowing the culture, and just being on the ground, being able to observe things, whether you're on the ground in China, whether you're on the ground at your Chinese client's office, to be able to have that face-to-face, not just understanding the nuance, understanding the high context communication, but also building the relationship. Because if you want to be able to have relationships with your Chinese clients or Chinese partners, if you're not taking time to actually go to where they are and spend time with them, then that kind of shows that you either don't understand Chinese culture, or aren't really focused on having a relationship with them. So, any other questions on these two pillars we've talked about? Any other questions relating to how do we, because again, I don't claim to be a China expert. I claim to specialize in the specific aspect of China. But if there's any other questions on developing questions, comments, or experiences on developing expertise on China, feel free to drop them in the comment section. We are on LinkedIn, we are on X, and we are on YouTube right now. So thanks to everyone who has joined us so far. If you have any comments, drop them down below or send me a DM afterwards. Now, pillar 3 is something that I've had a good deal of experience with, at least that's my perspective. And I think it's also something that a lot of traditional expats, say the ones who say they've worked here for 20, 30 years, they have more trouble with it, because when they started working in China, they were just living with the other expats. There was a much clearer divide, and they had all the power. And so they often just hung out with the expats, and they just did things that way. The problem is that if you have expatriates who are supposed to be here to guide it could be a company's operations in China, it could be to serve as a government representative in China. If they're spending most of their time with other foreigners, then I would wonder how much they're able to understand about China. Or even if they come with an understanding of China, I would then ask, are they able to keep up with changes in China, the Chinese people, if they don't have their finger on the pulse, I think is the best term. And in addition to that, local friendships with Chinese people, and not simply just say having a colleague you talk to at the office, but actually having people that are deep friends, not just, well, I would say first of all, being willing to kind of put yourself out there to become good friends with someone from a foreign culture. You then get deeper insight, not just because they're willing to share more with you, but as part of that friendship, you are then spending more time thinking about not simply what do I want as a foreigner in China, but, well, what does my Chinese friend think? What's the best way for me to show them that I am concerned for them in a way that they understand from their culture? What is the best way to give them a gift that is appropriate for them on their birthday in their culture? And so deeper friendships are one good way to really build more empathy, build more insight, and simply have more practice in how do you interact with Chinese people on their level. Because even if there's a Chinese person who is very internationalized, who can bridge the gap, but they're still going to be most comfortable in their own cultural context. And if you're willing to come to them and not just forcing them to come to you, that also does a lot to help build that relationship. Allows them to feel more comfortable opening up and sharing more details about their thoughts, their experiences. And aside from that, empathy is something that's very important, because one of the things that frustrates me when it comes to how foreign companies, foreign executives, government officials view China is I don't really feel like they view them as people. It seems like, from a political standpoint, maybe it's the enemy. When J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, called all Chinese peasants for some strange reason. It still seems very silly in retrospect. Or if you just view, if you're an executive, if you're managing a team in China, and you just view all Chinese as the same through all the same stereotypes, then you aren't able to see them as people, and that really has a big impact in my experience on if we can't view people the way they actually are, then we can't really understand them, and that impacts the advice, how we manage, how we react to China, how we compete with China, how we collaborate with China. And so it's tough. But being willing to take that step. I mean, there's a saying in Chinese where someone will say, 我能看到你的诚意. I can see your sincerity. And sincerity is very important. I mean, you can't just be going through the motions. If Chinese will be able to tell, as well as anyone can be, if you're just going through the motions versus if you're actually putting in the effort, if you're actually being serious about trying to understand not just their language and culture, but what they want as an individual, as a team, as an organization. And if the people who call themselves China experts are not willing to put in the effort to learn the language, to learn about the culture, to develop friendships and empathy for the Chinese people, then it's hard for me to understand how they can give substantive advice about how to deal with China, whether you view China as an enemy or as a potential friend or as a collaborative partner. If you don't understand the Chinese people, if you can't empathize with them, it's very hard for me to understand how you can give effective advice. I want to go back to some point I forgot to mention. If we talk about Pillar 2 being on the ground, one thing that has always been on my mind, I want to talk about journalists in China. I don't want it to be a sensitive topic. You know, obviously, I think it's best that there be more journalists in China. I think it's a great way for foreign countries to learn more about China, and having less foreign journalists in China means that there's less ability to get information about what China really is like out. But that being said, one of the criticisms I've heard and agree with for the most part about some foreign journalists in China is when they come here and they're reporting on China, they're sharing important news bulletins, but they don't speak Chinese. Now again, I did say that for most people, you don't necessarily have to know Chinese to start to understand China. Or, you know, you could focus on being here on the ground. You can focus on understanding the culture. You can focus on having deep friends, viewing the Chinese as people and not enemies. If you do that, you don't necessarily have to know the Chinese language. But from my standpoint, when it comes to reporters, people that are reporting on the news, we talked earlier about, you know, just the Ren Zhengfei example, about how there's such a gap between how language is expressed in English and in Chinese, that if a reporter who's supposed to report on, and it doesn't matter if there's local Chinese research assistants, as they're called, it's still the foreigner who maybe does, and some did speak Chinese, I'm sure, but there are definitely many I heard about who didn't speak Chinese. And if they're making the final decision about what the news is going to be reported as, and they had to play a game of telephone to try and understand what's happening in China or what the Chinese people are saying, there's always going to be inaccuracies. So this is an issue, this is just an example featuring journalists, but it's about how language is so important. Language and being on the ground is so important, and being able to get an accurate picture of what's happening in China. But that being said, hold on. Right, so here's another point, because I mentioned the example that Sunny had mentioned from the post that she made that inspired, that inspired this live stream, so thanks again, Sunny. But there was one expatriate manager who had spent 20 years in China, and he said he was a China expert. I can't say whether he was a China expert or not a China expert, or had expertise on China. But what it does make me think of is that, because we're talking about not simply being in China, but can you actually do things on yourself? Do you have to have an assistant? Can you manage a team by yourself? Can you go and buy a phone by yourself? Can you travel around the country by yourself without anyone just holding your hand? And from my standpoint, from me doing that same thing in China for 15 years, I therefore also think that it's very important. Because, again, I'm not going to single this person out because I don't know his personal backstory. But what I will say is that if I think of an expatriate executive, let's say he's a VP and he's over here in China, and he doesn't speak Chinese, he doesn't really understand China, but he does understand how to work with the HQ. And let's say that, he is a key member on his team, maybe his assistant, and however he wants to manage, that person then tells everyone and gets things done. Can we say that he's managing the team, or is he managing his assistant and his assistant manages the team? Again, I'm not saying it is this way or it isn't this way, but it's something to think about. Because if someone is going to be here, let's say the new ambassador from the United States comes over to China, but let's say their counterpart doesn't speak English. They probably will, but let's say they can't. If he can't directly speak or build relationships with that Chinese counterpart, is he really able to help build that relationship between the countries? I mean, to a certain point, I'm sure, and yes, you can use translators, but simply from my own personal experience, which will not apply to everyone else, if you aren't able to do something yourself in China, I think that limits your ability to bridge the gap. So, and again, this is not simply trying to judge people who don't speak perfect Chinese. I certainly don't. People who don't have a perfect knowledge of Chinese culture. It's simply a reminder that China, the whole idea of a China expert is elusive. And we always should be looking to be able to learn more, to be better at building relationships. And people who don't have that mindset, even if they don't speak Chinese, but if they're willing to improve in other areas, but people who don't have that mindset of constantly improving, I would hesitate to label them as maybe having deep China expertise. But it's, again, this is not a be-all, end-all discussion. It's simply sharing some of my experiences, bridging the gap for 15 years between China and the West. But I think it's also good for all of us to think about what does it really mean to have expertise on China or even a specific discipline. So finally, the last pillar I want to discuss, which I alluded to earlier, is leaving politics at the door. I'll speak mainly from the US standpoint, but if any of you from whatever countries you are watching from, if you want to leave any thoughts from your standpoint, your experience, feel free to drop a comment. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter X right now. If you have any comments or questions on the previous topics, the previous 4 pillars, or just about developing China expertise in general, feel free to leave a comment. I'm just going to take a short pause to see if anybody wants to leave a comment, and then we will continue. I see a few new people have joined, so thanks again for everybody who has come in recently. My name's Sean. I'm live streaming from Shenzhen, China, where I've lived and worked for 10 years, though I've lived in China for longer than that, for about 15, almost 16 years at this point. I've lived in places like Shanghai, obviously Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Hong Kong. I first lived long-term in China in Chengdu, in the Sichuan province, and that was back in 2004. And I've worked with many Chinese companies, and I've also worked with the Chinese government on a research project before. So the goal of today's topic is to examine what people, or what we should think about when we hear the idea of a China expert. I am liberally using the air quotes because what I think is that China expert is a fake term. Again, we just had a comment from Sunny who inspired this with one of her posts on LinkedIn. And I believe she also thought China expert wasn't a very good term because it really does not tell you what someone is experienced in. My expertise is working inside Chinese organizations, working with Chinese leaders, helping them expand overseas, and of course, bridging the gap between Chinese organizations and Western executives and organizations. So that's a very, 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 very specific thing that I do. More specifically, I do it mostly in tech, and I do it in mainland China and not in any of these other Chinese regions, Taiwan, Hong Kong, which are, again, ethnically Chinese, maybe culturally Chinese, but societally there are differences. And having Chinese is very important. Since we're on the topic of politics, I'll make a short aside. We've seen from the actions of US President Trump what a lack of understanding of China can do. It can lead to many missteps, an attempt at forcing concessions from China through a trade war and tariffs, which does not seem to be working out very well for them. I've talked to multiple Chinese companies that are pausing any interest to invest in the United States. They're working to pivot towards other countries simply because the US is now viewed as much more unreliable from a business standpoint than it used to be. And we will see probably in the coming months how much of a hit the US stock market, the US economy is going to take, as well as US consumers and small businesses. That's not something I'm looking forward to because my parents, my family's in the US too. But the issue with politics is that, aside from what I mentioned earlier about whoever is talking about China from a political standpoint, they're always going to have an agenda. They're often going to view China as an enemy, and it's going to color how they think. I mean, how many angry tirades, angry speeches on China do we hear about, where some political commentator, some politician is talking about how China, the communist country, which I take issue with because the Chinese Communist Party is in charge, but it's not the communism that was when Mao took over. It's it's authoritative, yes, it's not a democracy, but it is it is socialist, it has capitalist market characteristics. So anytime someone is labeling China as communist, it's immediately making people think the wrong things, making people think in a direction that is not necessarily reflective of what China actually is like on the ground. But in addition to that, if someone's talking about China from a political point of view, they have an agenda. One of the more annoying aspects of, we'll say, definitely fake China experts is people who write books about China, such as Gordon Chang, who has, I believe, been predicting the downfall of China every single year for the past 20 or 25 years, and every year he's proven wrong. Peter Navarro, the guy who claimed to be an expert on China, I believe a China trade policy, who literally made up a fake source to make himself sound like more of an expert on China. And he was a key advisor, I believe, during President Trump's first term. And so, it's one thing to have someone who thinks they understand China or pretends to understand China who doesn't, or it's even worse to fabricate credentials to try and get a job in government. And people like this, either who write books that are read by senior people, business people, government people, this can have a significant impact on the decisions that are being made. And if they're based on false information or a false understanding, they are going to have potentially disastrous consequences. And I believe one potential consequence of that is what we're seeing with the tariffs going wrong in the United States. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a dry throat. So any questions, comments on what we talked about before about developing China expertise, understanding China, drop them in the comments. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X right now. For those of you just tuning in, I'm Sean. I live and work in Shenzhen, China. I speak relatively fluent business Chinese. I do a lot of work with Chinese companies. Another reason, what I always tell people is that you don't have to like China. I prefer that you listen to my content and you like China. I think there's many things to like and respect about China, but you don't have to. I only think that you need to understand China. As long as you understand China, you can view them as the worst enemy of your country or the worst competitor. But if you understand them, you can at least make the right choices. But the problem is that when people, either in business or more often in politics, if they view China as the enemy, if they are approaching China with their own agenda, they're going to have bias. They're going to have, they're going to be convinced about what's going to happen or what should happen, or they're going to be convinced that China has to be like this because it then fits the narrative that they're trying to talk about. And it makes them completely miss any nuance that's happening. It makes them not understand what factors are going to impact the decisions that, say, Chinese political leaders or business leaders make. So it makes people run, and again, I'm not saying people can't be in politics and understand China. I'm simply saying that if you're wanting to understand China, you need to set politics aside, set aside any agendas, try and set aside any stereotypes, and then just try to say, okay, well, let's push everything away. What's actually happening? What do they actually want? What do they expect for? And that's a much better way to approach understanding not just China, but anything. Anytime we go into any debate, any discussion with preconceived notions, biases, stereotypes, it all leads us away from a real understanding of what's actually happening. So any questions, drop them in the comments. Otherwise, we'll be moving on. We will have a time where I'll pause for a few minutes at the very end of the live stream in case anybody has any more questions. But excuse me. If you are interested in learning more about China, you can definitely follow me on YouTube, X, and Instagram. It's Sean_China. I post there from time to time. And then, of course, if you are interested in China from a business standpoint, you can also follow me on LinkedIn. China Going Global, that's what I am. So, that being said, I'll just leave I'll leave this one down below. You can always send me a direct message as long as it's not overly hostile. I'm happy to discuss China. Hold on. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out. Not supposed to be that way. All right, let's see if we can fix this then. How is this supposed to work? Okay, well, apparently I broke through the stream studio, so we're just going to continue along this way. Again, any questions, comments, feel free to leave it in the chat or send me a DM later. So just going back over the topics that we've discussed today. There is no China expert because China is so vast and broad and nuanced that it doesn't make sense to say you're an expert. You need to say what you're an expert in specifically. And even then, saying you're an expert means that there's nowhere else you can go in terms of your learning and your understanding. But if we want to say we want to develop expertise on China, I think the key important aspects are language, understanding the culture. History can help too, but modern culture, how things work nowadays, is more important. On-the-ground experience, not just because of the nuances, because of, as Sunny mentioned, the high context culture, and also how fast things move, especially here in Shenzhen at China speed. Be willing to develop local friendships, relationships, empathy can also help. I think that one of the goals for anyone wanting to work in China, know about China, is to be able to independently navigate the culture, the cities, the society by yourself. And then, of course, lastly, especially considering how much energy geopolitics takes these days, and how much geopolitics impacts business and other areas of our lives. If we're going to try and understand China, really understand, but not simply make China fit the narrative that we're trying to talk about, it's important to at least put politics aside while we try and learn and understand China. It's not easy. It can't happen all at once. But I believe, again, this is based on my own experience, learning Chinese, speaking Chinese, working inside Chinese organizations, often only using the Chinese language. This has worked for me. I won't say I've done it perfectly. I think there's always room to improve. But I think that if someone is going to say they're an expert on China, I would say, okay, well, I would first ask, what makes them an expert? Okay, so I was like, okay, well, I would say, do you understand the language? Let's say they say they don't. And that's not necessarily a deal breaker, because I know some expatriates, one I was just talking to earlier on LinkedIn, who I knew from my Huawei days, and he's worked with Chinese companies for a long time. And I'm not sure if he speaks Chinese fluently or not, but even if he didn't, I would still think he has a long history with China and a deep knowledge of China. But language can be an important component. Cultural literacy, I would say, do they understand Chinese culture? Do they spend lots of time in China speaking with Chinese people? Do they have Chinese friends, or have they? I don't want to necessarily say have they married a Chinese person, because that can go either way. You can have an expatriate who maybe expects their Chinese partner to learn their language and they don't want to learn Chinese or adapt at all. But it could, if you do have a Chinese partner and you learn their culture, you learn their language, and you interact with their family members, that can be something too, in addition to maybe having just regular platonic friendships with Chinese people. Again, can you do things on your own in China? Can you be dropped anywhere in China with WeChat and money on your device, and then just survive? That's something to consider too. Can you, if you were sent here to manage a team, could you do it without anybody translating for you, without anybody acting as your assistant to help you manage things? So all of these are things we can think about when it comes to how do we move in a positive direction when it comes to developing an accurate understanding and useful expertise when it comes to China. So any questions? We're almost coming up to the Q&A section. Yeah, all right, so I'd love to hear, we already had a comment from Sunny, but I know we have people watching on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. If you have any questions, any thoughts, any thoughts on the the pillars we talked about in terms of what I think are important aspects to getting expertise on China. But if you have any thoughts or any experiences to share, such as misconceptions on China you've seen, if there's any pillars you agree with, pillars you don't agree with, if you have a different approach to learning about China, feel free to let me know. So we'll pause for a few minutes. I'll maybe talk about something else, but I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment. But yeah, I mean, it's China is definitely going to be one of the main powers, and despite people like Gordon Chang and others who write books without really actually spending time here, who write books about China collapsing, I mean, I don't really see anything that's going to prevent them from being more powerful than the United States, especially if we have leadership that basically destroys our own economy, and the Chinese companies and government can look elsewhere to develop relationships and connections in business. But especially if we did live in a world until recently where it was China and the USA as the two main powers. But if the US situation continues to deteriorate, then China may move into a position where it is very clearly the dominant power. And if that's the case, it's even then more important, because maybe in the past, if you were having trouble with China, you didn't understand China, oh, well, at least the USA, you can have a relationship with the USA. But if it's mainly China in the future, I'm not saying it will be, I'm saying based on what I've seen, I'm concerned that the USA is going to shoot itself in the foot even more than it already has. And if that's the case, then it's going to be even more important to understand China. In the past, at least with businesses in China, the Western businesses had all the power, they had the brands, and they could come, they could send expats with no China experience to manage the operations because many Chinese people at the time didn't have any experience overseas or with overseas companies. Whereas Chinese companies and politicians and businessmen, businesswomen are continuing to learn more about what overseas countries, overseas cultures, overseas languages. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we have less people, at least in the United States where I'm from, learning Chinese, learning about China, which, whether or not you view China as an enemy, as a friend, it puts us at a business disadvantage, an economic disadvantage, a political disadvantage. So this is one reason why, even though my day job is doing marketing, branding, public relations, project management, politics, geopolitics, global influence have a big impact on all of this stuff from the background at least. So again, any comments, feel free to drop them in the comment section if you're on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube. If not, feel free to DM me. That's always a fine option too. But I've really enjoyed being able to share my own perspective. I think that it's often overlooked. I think that people often don't think as much about what steps they need to take to understand China. And even if you, though I would say also if you maybe are interested in learning about China yourself, when you are consuming the news or whether you're reading about world events, I think it's very important to understand, if you're going to learn about China from the news or a specific reporter, you need to understand if they have the right level of expertise. Because, if I'm going to learn about aspects of China that I, say, didn't know before, I want to make sure that I'm trusting someone who has the right level of expertise. And if you're going to learn about China, you need to make sure that you're considering the sources, especially if you're not in China doing it yourself. If you're relying on other experts, you should make sure they actually are people who have a high level of real expertise on China, and not, on one hand, we could say not fake experts like, what was his name, Peter Navarro, or even people who think they have expertise, maybe expats who've worked here but never actually learned Chinese or learn much about Chinese culture. I mean, so we'll call them misguided experts. So just let that be the key takeaway, is that there's many aspects to developing expertise and knowledge about China, and just make sure that you take the right approach. Let's look at that list again. Is that language, cultural literacy, on-the-ground experience, local relationships, empathy, independent cross-cultural navigation, and political neutrality when it comes to at least learning about China. I think these are all important. So, if you're following me on LinkedIn, I will publish these slides tomorrow as a carousel. And so you can download that if you'd like, or you can view that if you want to look at it again. If you want to follow me, you can follow me on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at SeanYum_China for more insights on China. If you would like, you can also scan this QR code to follow me on LinkedIn, or just search for Sean Upton-McLaughlin. I'm always happy to answer questions on China. If your company is looking to come into China, feel free to reach out and let me know. Do a lot of work bridging the gap. So again, unless there's any more comments, I'll stay for a few more minutes in case there's any more comments. Then we'll probably end in a few minutes. But again, thanks for all of you who joined. Thanks to all of you who are still watching. I'll try and do at least one live stream every week on China, sometimes on Saturday, sometimes on Wednesday night. Feel free to reach out to me on any of these social platforms to let me know if there's a specific topic that maybe would be useful to you, useful to your company. The last one I did was on how to work better with Chinese clients. I did that after I talked to a number of agencies who were looking to have a better understanding of how to work with Chinese companies. So lots of interesting topics, I think. So on that note, oh, oopsie, sorry. There we go. So on that note, it's been great having all of you here, whether you're coming from LinkedIn, YouTube, or X. Definitely feel free to send me a DM with any thoughts, comments. If there's anything about the live stream that could be improved, feel free to let me know. It's getting a little late here in China, but again, I'll be doing this every week, I hope. And if you have any topics you'd like to hear about, let me know. Until then, thank you again. Thank you very much, all of you, for tuning in. And hopefully I'll see you next time. So, see you all later. Thanks again for joining.